do it correctly. And if the remote works. There we go. So here's the Ruth recap, the really quick one. Not quick. It's brief, but not really. So here's the deal. We need to understand sort of where we've come from to understand where we're going here. So the first thing we need to get is remind ourselves that Ruth is not an Israelite; she's a Moabite. I don't know if Pastor Mike walked through all the intricacies of what that means, but the nation of Moab has been an ancient enemy of Israel for years and continue to be. And we're a very wicked people from an idolatry and immorality perspective. They did some horrible, horrible things in worship of their gods. And so the nation of Moab was one that was absolutely opposed to the God of Israel and all of the morality that he demands of us and the standard that God has set. So the nation was one that was absolutely opposed to the nation of Israel in every possible way. So we know the story that Elimelech and Naomi go down to Moab and they're starving, and they go down there and they settle and then tragedy strikes. Well, they lose husbands, all of them. And so the two Moabite women and Naomi are there, all left as widows, destitute, and that's where the story sort of really begins. At the end of chapter 1, Ruth makes a really profound statement. It's a statement that sometimes we hear at weddings, and it's an okay thought to share at weddings, but it's really, if you look at the context, it's not about a wedding at all. It's about a daughter-in-law and a mother-in-law just declaring that they're loyal to each other. But in that statement Ruth makes, she says this, that your people be my people, where you go I go, where you stay I'll stay. And then she says, I think the most important part of it is, your God will be my God. And what she's saying in that moment is that she understands the failings of the gods of the Moabites, and she's embracing the God of the Hebrews. So clearly Naomi has had some sort of influence in her life to point her to Yahweh, to the one true living God, the God of Israel, which is what their purpose was all along. And Ruth determines that is the God that she is going to follow and serve and love and worship. Your God will be my God. So she changes from following the gods of the Moabites, who demanded some horrible things, to following the one true God. So the first thing you need to remember is that she's a Moabite, yes, but she has become a follower of Yahweh, of Jehovah. The next thing that we want to sort of remind ourselves of, and Pastor Mike's done a good job of sort of leading us into these things, is there's two things that I want us to get. And these are really important because they're going to play out in the balance of the narrative, the story of Ruth. And so don't miss them. So the first one he talked about was the law of gleaning. That's found in Leviticus chapter 19, verse 23, and chapter 23. And so the point of that law was to take care of those that were poor or marginalized in some ways. Also, it was there to help those that were simply traveling through Israel. So if you weren't a citizen, if you didn't belong to the nation, but you were traveling through Israel, God said there in Leviticus that he wanted to take care of those people. So those that are marginalized, probably widows would be the biggest group of that because of just the way culture worked, their ability to make a living and to sustain themselves would have been really hard, and so they would have required this help from farmers. And so the idea was that they would leave the corners or the edges of their field unharvested for those that were poor and needy. And God also said, and if the grain falls in the field, just leave it. Don't try and go back and pick it up again. Let it fall. That was God's way of providing for those in need. It was also a way of God providing for those who were passing through the nation. And so the sojourner, the one that didn't belong, God also wanted to provide for that. And so we want to see that Ruth fits both of those categories. The next thought or idea we find in the book of Deuteronomy, in chapter 25, and it's this idea of a redeemer. Now, depending on your version, it will have a very different word. The older versions, the more traditional versions, will use the word kinsman. And the newer versions, the newer translations, will have changed that word to redeemer, one that buys back. And in some versions, there's actually a combination where they sort of smush those two together and they call them kinsman - redeemer. So the point is that they're the exact same idea. And we'll talk about that as we get there. But I want you to understand that's sort of the idea. The idea of redeemer was an important one in Israel. And the redeemer actually had three different purposes, three different opportunities to buy back, which is what the word redeem means, to buy back, or to pay the price for. So the first one was, if a relative like a brother or someone had got himself into debt and had to sell things or to sell himself into slavery in order to pay that debt, and he would work for so many years, the next brother in line had the opportunity and to some degree the obligation to pay the debt for that brother if they were able to. And so that would happen, and so the debt would be paid, and then the person would have freedom and have their property and their freedom returned to them. That was sort of one option for this idea of redeemer. The next one was a very different one. We know what the law stated: an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and they did that. In other words, the crime matched the punishment, and vice versa. And so if a brother was murdered, like in cold blood, premeditated, those kind of things, then the next redeemer would have the obligation to serve vengeance on that person that had murdered their relative. And so that's a very, very different sort of thing. The third thing that we're going to talk about, and this is the one that applies to Ruth, is that if a brother should die and didn't have any heir, no male son to carry on the lineage, the next oldest brother would take the wife of the man that had died, take him as his wife. And here's the thing: the first male child that was born would be not seen as their child, but would be seen as the child of the brother that had passed away, that had died, and thereby continue his lineage or his line, and his name would be continued on throughout history. And so the terror or the horrible result of a person dying without an heir was that their line would end, and in Jewish culture that was horrible. So God establishes this way for lineage to be kept continued even though that situation had happened. And that's the one that we're going to look at for the next couple of weeks. But here's my point in talking about all of that stuff, and Pastor Mike, I know, has already sort of walked through bits of this. But here's the thing. We sort of look at the Bible sometimes and go, oh, yeah, that's a nice thought. And there's these little verses that are here and there and everywhere. And we go, well, that's a good idea, or that's great. But they don't really seem to apply too much anywhere else in the Bible or even to us. I mean, especially when we get to the law, like Leviticus and Deuteronomy. Those are the books of the Old Testament that when you're reading them, your eyes kind of glaze over at some point. And let's just be honest, that's what happens, isn't it? It's like, what are all these laws? And how do they apply to me? And why would God bother to put all of them in there? That's a really important thing for us to consider. And we can think that way. I think that way. So if no one else in the room thinks that way, I'm just admitting. When I get to them, it's like, oh, these are painful. but they're there for a reason. And I want you to get this. I've said this very, very often. God doesn't do random. God is not a God who just sort of puts stuff down willy-nilly and makes up a whole bunch of laws for no reason. And what I want you to see is that 200 or 300 years at least before the time of Ruth, God has put into his law these two ideas, one of gleaning and one of redemption, that are going to come and meet in the life of one person. And I can't say this for sure, because I know that God always cares about the poor, and he always cares about the sojourner, and he always cares about those that have had tragedy strike. I know God always cares about all of it, but I got to wonder, just given what is about to happen, I can't help but wonder that maybe, just maybe, those two ideas, those two concepts, those two laws that have governed the nation of Israel for centuries were there exactly for this time. That God's biggest plan was that for this moment, for this individual case, 200-300 years earlier, he'd put into the law, into the fabric of the Jewish society, these ideas. And he did it for this specific time. And these two ideas are now going to crisscross in the life of Ruth. And they're going to change everything for her. And so the point is this, that all of the loss, all of the emptiness, all of the stuff that they have lost or seemingly lost as far as people that they love are concerned, and all of the devastation and all of the struggle and all of the turmoil that they have endured, probably seemed at times that God had just abandoned them. And so I think just to sort of take a moment, take a breath, take a step back and go, but I think God knew this was going to happen all along. And a few centuries before, he put in place everything that was going to be required to turn this tragedy into a triumph, to turn the loss into legacy. So, it's with that sort of as our backdrop, understanding that when they didn't even feel like God was at work, he was setting the stage in a way that they never could have imagined. So, let's take a look at Ruth chapter 3. And we'll do it kind of like Pastor Mike was. We'll just look at a couple of verses, draw out some thoughts, look at a couple of verses, draw out some thoughts. Then, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not seek rest for you, that it may be well with you? Is not Boaz our relative, with whose young women you were? See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor." So, first thought is this. The first idea that we want to get out of this is Naomi's heart. Naomi's thought process in all of what is about to transpire, what Naomi is about to suggest, which is kind of crazy, but what she's about to suggest is motivated by this idea. Ruth, I know it has been hard for you. There's been tragedy in your life, and I want the best for you. So I want you to be able to settle down, to have a settled life, to not be sort of following me wherever I go, to not be dependent on me and I on you. I want you to establish your own family, your own circle again. And I want you to have a settled life. And that's what she says. Isn't it a good thing that I seek rest for you? I want you to settle down and enjoy life. So that's the first thought, and that's the motivation that's going to drive everything. So it's important we know that. Like you can't just sort of throw that verse away. That's an important one. There's Naomi's motivation and everything she's about to suggest. The next thought that comes across is this one, where it says that Boaz, and we know all this about the relative being the Redeemer, and we've sort of teased out that thought a little bit before in chapter 2. Here's the deal. Now, here's an opportunity, she says. Boaz is actually winnowing grain on the threshing floor tonight. You need to understand sort of what happened in the ancient world to make sense of that verse, I think. So basically what happened is all of the farmers would grow their grain in the field surrounding a spot, and there was a place that was a shared place, and it was called the threshing floor. And the idea was that you would take turns and rotate through, and when it became your turn, your men, your staff, your workers would all do the work of coming to a spot. And the suggestion is this: there were places where up against a hill where a wind would come in and it would blow in and it would sort of circle around and hit that mountain or that hill and provide a great spot when you threw the grain and all of the stuff up, all of the chaff and all of the junk and the straw and everything get blown away, and the heavy grain would fall back down. That's that process of winnowing. So it comes to the time where Boaz's turn is at the threshing floor. So he's got all of his people, all of his workers, all of his connected family, extended family, like all hands on deck is what I'm saying. And so there have been a whole bunch of people trying to get the grain processed as fast as possible. It's Boaz's turn there tonight. So you sort of know where he is or where he's going to be for a while, because it's going to take a while. You don't just go. There's no combine in the picture at this point. So it's a process that's going to take a bit. They're probably going to be there for a couple of days working through getting this grain processed. So there's sort of the backstory for what's about to happen. So Naomi says, I have this great idea. Look at what verse 3 says. Wash therefore, and anoint yourself, and put on your cloak, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man, Boaz, until he has finished eating and drinking. But when he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do. And she, Ruth, replied, all that you say, I will do. So what do we do with that? Well, let me put a few thoughts out there, and I want you to just sort of understand everything I'm about to say beyond this is in light of this. Number one, this was a really, really dangerous thing to do for Ruth. And it is not capital N-O-T, not a pattern to follow. And it's not capital N, capital O, capital T, immoral, but it was very unusual and honestly pretty provocative. In the ancient world, what Naomi is suggesting that Ruth do is about as provocative as it gets. But as I said, no immorality is ever described or even hinted at in the story. So so what does this mean? So here's what's happening. She says, I want you to go and get all dressed up. And so it's beyond sort of just take a shower, you smell bad. It was like, go get yourself all cleaned up and anoint yourself. Make yourself attractive. Put on your cloak, probably your best cloak. Might be the only cloak, but it was you put on your cloak and look the best you possibly can. I want you to go down to the threshing floor and watch. Because what I'm going to ask you to do now, you don't want to do to the wrong guy. So watch where he lies. When you're watching Boaz, make sure you aim in the right spot. Because what I'm about to ask you to do, you all want to make sure, wrong guy is not words that come out of your mouth. And she's about to break sort of all of the cultural rules. She's a worker, going to approach an owner. She's a Moabite, about to approach an Israelite. She's she's a woman approaching a man. Like, there's a lot of cultural things that are at play here. And sort of everything is topsy-turvy in this moment. But the amazing part is this, that Ruth sort of knows all of the inferences of what is being asked. And she says, I'll do it. So you can sort of imagine all of the workers gathered around eating after a hard day's work. And the Bible tells us that they were eating and they were drinking. Now, I'm not suggesting anyone was out of control, but you do understand that a finely dressed, good-smelling woman walking through a whole bunch of farm workers is putting her in a pretty precarious position. And I think Naomi understood that. And she says, be careful. But Ruth said, I'll do it. I'm willing to do whatever you ask of me. It's not immoral, but it was sure dangerous. And so I just say this to say, like, this is not a pattern that we would ever suggest for our daughters, is it, dads? Never. We would never think, oh, this is a good strategy, this is a good plan for her finding a husband. Like, this is what I want for my daughter. It's like, no. You don't do any of that. You protect yourself at all costs. You make sure you're in the safest possible place. You don't put yourself in harm's way in any way, shape, or form. And you certainly don't act out of character for what people are expecting. I mean, we have these parameters for our kids. And as dads, I think especially, but probably moms too, can't speak for moms not being one, but for dads, it's like, I'm going to protect my daughter. I'm never going to let her go into a place where she is in danger at all. Yeah, that's exactly what happens here. So these guys were well fed. They were happy. The Bible calls that being, their hearts are merry. And the whole point is now Ruth enters into that, and she does what Naomi asked her to do. So let's see what happens. It's risky, dangerous, and provocative. So she went down. She went down to the threshing floor and did just as her mother-in-law had commanded her. And when Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was merry, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. Then she came softly and uncovered his feet and lay down. So what happens here is that Boaz is a little bit isolated at this point in time. So Boaz is kind of on his own. He's literally lying on the heap of grain, which sort of says he's close to the mountain, which says he's probably close to the end of his men. He's sort of isolated, and I'm sure providentially that's what God's plan was all along. And he got lying down there, and so Ruth does what Naomi had asked her. She came down softly and uncovered his feet. Now, where does that all sort of fit in, or how does that make sense at all? So here's the picture. She comes in and she lies at his feet. And we won't get into all the nuances of that, but that was not an abnormal thing. It was a sign of honor for a husband in the ancient world. We would think it's crazy weird now, but that's what happened. So she uncovers his feet and basically makes herself vulnerable to him, and sort of is suggesting that she needs his protection and she needs his care. So if you're looking for verses that would help you sort of understand that, I'll give them to you. Psalm 57 is one of them. Psalm 57, and that is in verse 1. It says this: "Be merciful to me, O God, be merciful to me, for in my soul take refuge." Look at this. "And in the shadow of your wings I will take refuge." Just a couple of pages over, Psalm 61, verse 1. Psalm 61, verse 4, sorry. "Let me dwell in your tent forever. let me take refuge under the shelter of your wings. Then a little further on, Psalm 91 says this: he who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will abide in the shadow of the Almighty. Then down to verse 4, and he will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. So, this is a thought, this is an idea that under the wings or under the garment or under the cloak of your husband, you find protection and care. So the picture that was being portrayed or is about to be portrayed is that spreading of the garment over someone would suggest that you are willing to protect and care for them. So, verse 8 says this: and at midnight the man was startled and turned over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. Which is like you would be startled if you didn't go to sleep that way and all of a sudden now you're that way. And why he was startled, I'm guessing, probably because his feet got cold. So at midnight he startled and turns over, and behold, a woman lay at his feet. And he says the most logical thing you possibly can say. He asks, "Who are you?" Which is a good question. When you're waking up and you find somebody that you weren't expecting there, and I don't know all the details, but in my mind I'm sort of thinking Boaz is clearly identifying this as the shape of a woman, but it's probably dark. He probably can't really make out who it is, although maybe he has a guess, but he has a really good question, because who are you is an important one. Like, are you here to kill me? Are you here for some bad reason? Or who are you? Why are you here? It's a good question. So he asked that question. Who are you? And she answered, look at verse 9. I am Ruth, your servant. And then here's the interesting part. Because right up to then, she's done exactly what Naomi told her, right? Like she's done exactly what Naomi said. Remember the plan was? Lie down at his feet, and he will tell you what to do. That was the plan. It's at this point that Ruth kind of goes off script. And she says, I'm Ruth, your servant. And look what she asks or makes a statement. She says, spread your wings or your garment over your servant, for you are a redeemer. Wow. Important thought here. First of all, she's saying, I want your protection and care. That's what she's suggesting. She's really proposing marriage, which again I said is kind of counterculture. But the bigger question, the more surprising part of this really is, why are we doing this? What is it about the relationship between Ruth and Naomi that is so unique, that is so important, that is so valuable, that is so profound, that we get to this plot? And I want you to sort of see what it is. What was Naomi's motivation up there in verse 1? I want you to have a settled life, right? I want you to be able to be at rest. I want you to have a settled life. But in this statement, Ruth makes a really profound idea come forward. Because she says, I'm Ruth. I want to become your wife. I want you to be my husband. But she adds the most important bit. For you are a redeemer. And why is that so important? Because it's true, isn't it? And they all knew it. Boaz at this point was not going, oh, wow, I didn't know that. He knows it. He knows it all along. But what this does, I think, is it drives forward the motivation for Ruth. Naomi says, Ruth, I want you to have a settled life. That's why I'm telling you to do this. That's why I'm putting you into this precarious, dangerous, unorthodox, somewhat provocative place. I'm doing this so that you can have a settled life. And Ruth says these words, but you're a redeemer. That's why I want you to be my husband. And in those words, Ruth is not saying, I want it for me. What he's really saying is, Naomi, I will do as you ask so that you will have a lineage. Because that's what the Redeemer did. See, Ruth wasn't there for herself. She wasn't there because of what she was going to get out of it. She was there because of her love for Naomi and her care for her. And she wanted a line to come out of Naomi's family line. That's why she was there. And so we see this wonderful friendship, this wonderful kindness between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. And I would dare say it was pretty rare in that day, and probably, believe it or not, probably rare today as well. Like they were clearly, completely in love with each other. They cared so much for each other. They were the best and deepest of friends. It would be great if that was the way mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws operated today. I don't think it always is that case. That's all I'm saying. But there's a great picture of what it could be. And so the motivation for Naomi and for Ruth are very different. Why are we doing this? Because I want you to have a settled life. No. I'm going to put myself in this tenuous situation because I want a legacy for you. There's friendship. There's great friendship in that. Well, let's keep going because the story is not quite done. In fact, we're not going to get it done this week. But anyway, look at chapter 10 or verse 10. So as a result of Ruth making this request, become my husband, to redeem and to bring a line for Naomi. Look at what it says in verse 10. And he said, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. You have made this last kindness greater than the first, in that you have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. So his response was an interesting one. It wasn't yes, was it? At least not right away. He gets there, but he makes this statement, and he makes a really interesting connection. He says this, may you be blessed by Yahweh, my daughter, which is a much kinder word than servant, which is what Ruth used just in the verse before. But he says, you have made this last kindness better than or greater than the first. And the first kindness or the first grace, I think, that was that she turned to follow the one true God of the universe. That's, I think, what it is. But Boaz says, but this bit is even better than you just trusting in God to lead your life, to rule your life, and to worship. He says, this kindness is greater than anything else you've done. And he tells why. He says, first, because you could have, Ruth, gone after younger guys. So clearly Boaz is maybe getting on in years, but he's the one that is ordained by God to be the redeemer of Ruth and for Naomi. And so he sees the deal here, right? He says there's a whole bunch of guys that you could have pursued, but you chose me. You chose me, and he was amazed by it. But I want you to see, underline that word kindness in your Bible there. So you've made this last kindness. That's a really interesting word. It's a big word. It's a huge word, actually, in the mind of Israel. It's hesed is the Hebrew word. It's the word that gets translated as steadfast love over and over and over again, especially in the Psalms. So steadfast love is that it's the love of God for his covenant people that is unending, that is unconditional. It is as close to what the New Testament calls agape, the perfect love. It's the love of God for his people. And it's this steadfast love. It's the love you can count on. When things are not going well, you can still say, but God loves me with this steadfast love. This love is not going anywhere. But it's a little bit beyond that. It's that idea of faithfulness. It's the idea of compassion. It's the idea of mercy. It's the idea of grace. If you sort of package all of those things together, you begin to understand what this love, grace, mercy idea is for God and his people. And then Boaz uses it in reference to what Ruth has done. This grace, this compassion, this mercy that you've shown to me. And by the way, I'll give you two references. The word has already been used two other times in the book of Ruth. It is Ruth 1:8 and Ruth 2:20. And both times they are talking about God showing that covenant love, that steadfast love, that hesed for the people. It is an origin of God. And so Boaz, by saying that, is also recognizing what is happening right now has its origins not just in the heart of man, not just in the desires of people, but in the very heart of God. This is God's plan that is unfolding before our eyes. It is not just you trying to get something yourself. Okay. And if you want, I'll give you two other references. We don't have time to really look them up. But here's two other references. Nehemiah 1:5 talks about the steadfast love of God, and Psalm 26:3 are both great verses that just talk about this steadfast love of God. I'm fighting with this today. I am fighting with this today. Okay. And then it says this. Now, my daughter, do not fear. Because now we're going to see what his real answer is. This is where he says yes. I will do for you all that you ask, for all my fellow townsmen know that you are a worthy woman, a virtuous woman, a woman that is, number one, available to marry, but also one that is worth marrying, a woman of high character. And look at verse 12. And now it is true that I am a redeemer. That much is true. But, that contrast words. There is a redeemer nearer than I. So here's the deal. This whole idea of kinsman redeemer, that it was the next in line that had the first responsibility, first opportunity to redeem whatever it was. In that whole kinsman redeemer thing in Deuteronomy, that's what it was talking about, the next in line. And there was we won't go into it, but if you read Deuteronomy 25, 5-10, you get the whole picture of what's going on. And we'll talk about sandals next week. But it was a big deal. And you give up your right, you give up your line, and the next person in line takes place. So Boaz is saying that. He's saying this, hey, listen, I'm a redeemer. I'm in your line. It's possible for me to do it. But we all need to understand there's somebody between me and you, and there's one that is even closer related to Elimelech. So, we're going to have to work that through. And this is kind of like the red alert, right, of the moment. It's like, well, this is good, but we still have a giant hurdle to get over. Because what you're proposing is fine, but it may never, ever, ever come to pass. It may never be what you're suggesting it be, because there is someone between you and me that can do what you've asked of me. And if that happens, then what you're suggesting here is not going to be possible. So there's still some drama. There's still some uncertainty. There's still some angst here. So what do we do? What do we do? Look at verse 13. Remain here in the morning, and I'll redeem you. Good, let it be him. Good, let it be him to do it. But if he's not willing to redeem, then as the Lord lives, I will redeem you. Then he says, lie down until the morning. So she lay at his feet until the morning, but arose before anyone could recognize another. So in other words, they're still trying to have some prudence in the process. And there's, like I said, no indication that anything other than her spending the night there happened. So there's no immorality inferred or suggested in any way. So lie down until the morning. She gets up in the morning before anyone could recognize anybody. It was still pretty dark. You could see shadows, and that's kind of it. And he said, look at this. And here he is protecting her reputation. Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor. I want you to go with your integrity intact, because that is appropriate in this situation. So here's the question that I kind of struggle with. But I think, why did Naomi even suggest this crazy idea? I think because Naomi knew a whole lot more about Boaz and Ruth than even the Bible tells us. Because Naomi had lived with them. And she knew their character. And then they knew, and she knew the way they would respond. And they knew, and she knew that they would be pure in the way they dealt with this really unorthodox situation. I think Naomi knew a whole lot more about them than we do. But I think that's the reason. And so based on the character of both Ruth and of Boaz, Naomi suggests this crazy idea. And it's played out perfectly, because at the end of it, Boaz is still protecting Ruth and her reputation, and making sure that no one has even the chance to suggest in rumor or in gossip what has happened. So then he says this. And he said, bring me the garment you're wearing, hold it out. So she held it out, and he measured out 6 measures of barley and put it on her when she went into the city. So measures, it's up for debate how much that was. And it's a lot in any case. And the fact he has to put it on her means she's kind of carrying it like a beast of burden would have to carry it. It's a lot of weight. It's a lot of weight. Probably weighed as much as she did. I don't know. It probably didn't. But it's 50, 60 pounds of grain she's hauling back to town. He puts it on her. She went into the city. Verse 16. And she came in to her mother-in-law, and she asked, how'd you fare, my daughter? And she told her all that the man had done for her. So she tells the story. And then look at verse 17. Saying, these 6 measures of barley he gave to me, for he said to me, look at these words, you must not go back empty-handed to your mother-in-law. What's Boaz saying? He's saying from this day on, things will change. Things are going to be different. And what a great contrast to just flip back one page. Look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 21. Look at the words of Naomi. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. That's how bad it was. And you flip the page, and this guy Boaz says, I never want to send you back to your mother-in-law empty-handed. She came back empty. From this point on, her life will be full instead. So now we wait. Now we wait, because the story's not done. And she replied, well, we're going to wait. We're going to wait. Wait, my daughter, until you learn how the matter turns out. We're going to see how this all plays out, because it is now the day. And it's the day that things are going to get sorted. And she says, we're going to see how it turns out. For the man will not rest, but will settle the matter today. We will not have to wait long, but we will have to wait and see how it all plays out, because what we've proposed may never come to pass, and we're going to have to trust. We're going to have to trust Boaz. We're going to have to trust God in all of this to play it out exactly the way we would hope that it would. So now we wait, and we see what God has planned, and we see what God is going to do. And if we learn anything in this chapter, we sort of want to take away this one idea, that the tragedy and the loss and the hurt and all of the stuff that Ruth and Naomi have dealt with up to this point may have given them the inclination, may have given them the thought that God had abandoned them. God doesn't care about them. God is completely forgotten about them. And nothing could be further from the truth. Because like I said, 200 years before, God had already put in place all of the mechanisms to make this story a great story, a story of triumph, a story of victory, a story of blessing, a story of legacy. And even when Ruth and Naomi couldn't see it, God was at work in their lives. And sometimes you and I need to sort of embrace that same thought, that when it seems like God is far away and God is uninterested in what's going on in our lives, we need to understand that even when we don't see him, even when we don't see God active and working and moving, he is still working and he still cares for us and he still loves us. Even when we don't see him, he is at work. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for this great story of Ruth and the story of a faithful God. A God who saw it all ahead of time, who saw the need of a young woman and her mother-in-law and put in place everything that needed to happen in the most obscure, hidden way possible, and yet they come to be so powerful. God, help us to understand that even though we don't always see you active and working in our lives, that you are always working, you are always active, that you care about us individually on those days where we feel discouraged and disappointed. God, I pray that you would help us to find encouragement and hope in a God who is faithful, a God who has that covenant, unconditional, steadfast love for your people. And so, God, I would pray that today we would relish and we would rest in the notion that you are at work in our lives and you are a God who is good and faithful and compassionate and merciful and gracious, and you love us so much. God, help us to rest in that today. We pray it in Jesus' name.